Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as Empress was born in 1851, in a time when the Joseon Dynasty was quietly unraveling. Her name was Myeongseong, the orphaned daughter of a fallen noble family from Yeohung. She came from a secondary branch of the powerful Yeohungmin clan, respected but not dominant. Her father died when she was just 8 years old. What she lacked in influence, she carried a name. That name would be enough. In 1866, King Gojong had recently taken the throne as a teenager, but the real authority rested with his father, the Daewongun, the regent who ruled through force, tradition, and fear. The Daewongun needed a queen for his son, someone from a noble house, yet without strong family alliances that could threaten his control. Myeongseong was chosen not for her wealth, nor her ambition, but for what they assumed was her emptiness. She arrived at Gyeongbokgung as a bride in name, cloaked in quiet grace. But within the first months of her marriage, it became clear that she would not remain a background figure. As queen consort, she began to read state documents, ask questions, and observe the internal workings of the court. She formed ties with officials the Daewongun distrusted. She engaged with Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, and later Western diplomats. These were not the actions of a ceremonial wife. They were the quiet decisions of someone who understood that power was not inherited. It was shaped. Ministers noticed, courtiers whispered, and the Daewongun watched. He had underestimated her. Her early years in the palace were marked by observation, not confrontation. But even in silence, her presence created friction. The royal court, long a place of ritual and male dominance, now had a queen who was not content with embroidery and etiquette. She requested meetings with officials. She read foreign treatises. She supported modern schools and printed materials. In her early 20s, she began assembling a circle of loyal reformers, including relatives from the Min family who shared her vision. Slowly, without public defiance, she shifted the court's balance. The traditionalists sensed it. The old guard began to describe her not as a queen, but as a threat. The Daewongun's frustration grew, and tensions deepened when she gave birth to a son in 1871, an heir to the throne. The birth of the crown prince shifted the royal succession firmly in her favor, diminishing the Daewongun's future influence. Though the child died a few years later, the event had already marked a turning point. She had secured a place not just beside the king, but within the future of the dynasty. Her involvement in politics expanded. She recommended appointments. She blocked others. She read daily briefings before her husband. Foreign envoys began to report that it was the queen, not the king, who drove the palace's direction. Her reputation grew beyond the court, across the provinces, and into foreign capitals. But this rise was not without cost. Her assertiveness, in a society shaped by male hierarchy and rigid Confucian values, was seen by some as rebellion. Every move she made became a point of criticism. Every alliance she forged stirred resentment. Her court became divided. To some, she was a symbol of progress. To others, a woman out of place, dangerous precisely because she did not shout but watched. Even as she advanced her influence in subtle ways, many believed she was pulling the strings of the king himself. Gojong's reliance on her was noted but rarely discussed aloud. What was once assumed to be a quiet partnership was evolving into something far more consequential. And while her name was still spoken cautiously behind the folding screens and embroidered partitions of the court, it was no longer spoken softly. Myeongseong was born into a lineage that once held influence. But by the time she reached adolescence, her family's fortunes had declined. Her father, Min Ji-rok, was a minor official with a reputation for classical learning and upright conduct, but he died when she was still a child. With his death, the household's social standing weakened, and its financial support vanished. What remained was the family name, a connection to the Yohung Min clan, and a library of texts rooted in Confucian teachings. Unlike many noble daughters of her time, she was not shaped by luxury or ceremony. Instead, her world was formed by silence, study, and the careful observation of others. In a dynasty where women were expected to uphold tradition through modesty and service, her education became her quiet rebellion. She learned how dynasties rose and collapsed, how kings ruled and lost control, how words could wound more deeply than weapons. She was trained in calligraphy and the histories of earlier queens, and she saw how power often shifted not in open conflict, but behind closed doors. Her mother's presence was firm but restrained, and the lessons passed down were not about ambition, but about survival. These early years, though secluded, gave her a sense of how status could vanish in a generation and how difficult it was to recover once lost. By the time she entered adolescence, the royal court had begun its search for a queen consort. The Daewongun, regent to the young King Gojong, held full authority over the selection. He sought a bride who would not disturb his power, someone from a respected but weakened family, an emblem of nobility without political backing. Myeongseong fit the profile precisely. When she was summoned to court, she brought no dowry of consequence, no powerful relatives to speak on her behalf. Her selection was made with political calculation, and she was seen as a figure who would bend quietly to the will of others. But the court misunderstood what they had invited within their walls. The young queen did not arrive with demands or threats. She arrived with attentiveness. In the palace, she watched how influence moved through gifts, appointments, and carefully worded memorials. She took note of which ministers deferred to the Daewongun and which ones remained silent. She remembered the names of those who underestimated her. And when her own family was offered minor court positions, she accepted with measured restraint. Never too quickly, never too many. It was not loyalty she tested, but the weight of each decision. In the early years of her reign, she spoke little in public, but behind the scenes, she used what she had learned in isolation: discernment, patience, and the careful use of alliances. She supported literary societies. She read records of court precedents. She studied not only Korea's histories, but the patterns of foreign courts, especially Qing China and Japan. These efforts were not yet reforms, but preparations. The queen was building a foundation, not of gold or favor, but of understanding. It was this quiet intellect that would later shape the policies, alliances, and crises of her rule. And while the court still whispered of her as a convenient pride, the weight of her silence was slowly beginning to reshape the balance of power. In the final years of the 1870s, as King Gojong matured into his rule, the quiet influence of Queen Myeongseong began to take unmistakable form. The court still moved under the shadow of the Daewongun, Gojong's father, whose traditionalist views and iron rule had defined the early reign. But the queen had begun to reshape the space around the king, slowly, deliberately, and with strategic precision. She did not challenge the regent openly. Instead, she focused on appointments. She placed trusted relatives in positions previously held by conservative nobles. She recommended officials who favored reform, scholars who studied beyond the boundaries of the peninsula, and diplomats who spoke of the world beyond Joseon's shores. Each choice was framed as loyalty to the throne, but each one shifted the balance away from the Daewongun and toward her own growing network. Her ability to maneuver within the strict constraints of court protocol was a mark of discipline and foresight. Ministers who dismissed her as a ceremonial figure soon found their access to the king restricted. Some were quietly reassigned. Others retired under pressure. At the center of these changes stood figures like Min Seung-ho and Min Gyom-ho, men of her clan, educated and ambitious, who began to occupy central roles in state administration. Though they lacked the military power of the Daewongun's allies, they held influence over internal affairs, education, and diplomacy. The Queen's vision for Korea was not built on resistance alone, but on preparation for a different kind of survival, one shaped by adaptation to the modern world, not isolation from it. Foreign influence was accelerating. Japan had already forced Joseon to open ports through the Treaty of Ganghwa in 1876, marking the beginning of a new era of external pressure. The Queen responded not by retreating, but by expanding her circle of advisors. She brought in interpreters, translators, and Korean officials who had studied foreign laws and sciences. She encouraged the creation of modern schools and supported missions to Qing China and further abroad. These moves were not without risk. Each step toward reform threatened the Confucian order the court was built upon. The scholar officials, who believed in maintaining ritual and hierarchy, saw her as a disruptive force, a queen meddling in the realm of men, and worse, a woman leading the kingdom toward foreign entanglement. Yet within the walls of Gyeongbokgung, it was clear who held the momentum. King Gojong, though formally sovereign, leaned more heavily on his wife's counsel than on his father's dictates. She read reports before he did. She briefed ministers in his name. She answered foreign inquiries with authority and precision. This shift unsettled the old court factions, particularly those tied to the Daewongun, who now found their traditional influence eroding. The court had once imagined her as a placeholder. Now they watched her build a system that did not need their permission to function. The Queen was no longer simply choosing ministers, she was defining the government's path. But power restructured too quickly can provoke reaction. And in the quiet halls beyond her growing council, resentment thickened. Her choices, once mocked, were now feared. And among those displaced by her rise, some no longer believed this change could be reversed by politics alone. By the early 1880s, the fragile balance within the Joseon court fractured once more. The Queen's growing authority, the rise of her reformist allies, and her willingness to look beyond the peninsula for diplomatic leverage had unsettled the old order. At the center of that resistance stood her father-in-law, the Daewongun. Yi Ha-young had ruled as regent with absolute force during his son's minority, enforcing Confucian orthodoxy and isolationist policies. Though formally retired, his shadow had never left the palace. Now, as foreign envoys expanded their presence in Hanseong, and Japanese influence deepened after the opening of the ports. The Daewongun returned to political life, not as an advisor, but as a force determined to reclaim the kingdom's direction by erasing hers. His re-emergence came with sweeping measures. Conservative factions rallied to him, and one by one, the Queen's appointments were overturned. Ministers loyal to her were removed or exiled. Her relatives, who had anchored her network of support, were pushed to the margins. The court that had begun to speak of reforms was silenced. The Daewongun moved quickly to reassert Joseon's closed-door stance, cutting back foreign missions, rejecting Western education initiatives, and ordering the suppression of modernist newspapers. In his view, the Queen had pulled the dynasty too far toward dangerous foreign entanglements, risking sovereignty under the guise of progress. But beneath that political rhetoric was something older, a personal feud, sharpened by years of quiet defiance and unseen resistance. Queen Myeongseong did not fight back with decrees or proclamations. She did not have the Daewongun's control over the army or the support of long-entrenched officials. But she had something the regent did not trust: relationships with Qing diplomats and growing connections with foreign powers who had come to see her as the voice of Joseon's cautious modernization. She opened lines of communication with the Chinese envoy Yuan Shikai, whose presence in Korea had grown following China's increased assertion of influence on the peninsula. While the Daewongun pushed for a return to isolation, the Queen maneuvered to use China's strength as a shield. In 1882, the court's internal tensions erupted into open violence. The Imo Incident, a mutiny by disaffected soldiers, was triggered by months of unpaid wages and food shortages. But beneath the surface, the unrest was fueled by political manipulation. The Daewongun exploited the chaos to consolidate power. His supporters encouraged the violence, and when the palace was attacked, reformist officials and foreign advisors were targeted. The Queen fled the palace in disguise, aided by loyal retainers. For a brief period, the Daewongun stood at the center of the throne once more. But this return was short-lived. The Qing Empire, alarmed by the instability and protective of its own regional interests, responded by sending troops. The Daewongun was seized by Chinese forces and taken to Tianjin, effectively exiled by the very foreign power he had sought to keep at bay. In his absence, Queen Myeongseong returned. But her restoration came not through triumph, but through a new kind of dependency. Joseon was no longer moving in isolation. The court was now entangled in a network of foreign interests, and the Queen, though publicly bowed, had ignited a transformation that could not be undone. In the sweltering summer of 1882, tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of the Joseon court erupted into violent revolt. The Imo Incident, sparked by discontent among the military, began with unpaid wages and rice rations laced with sand. But it did not end there. The deeper roots were political. For months, traditional military units had been sidelined, while newly formed troops, trained in modern methods and often aligned with foreign instructors, received favored treatment. The Queen's growing influence, her ties to reformist officials, and her support for foreign engagement had already drawn criticism. In the eyes of the angry soldiers and the conservative factions backing them, her policies were not only divisive, they were dangerous. On July 23rd, soldiers rose in open mutiny. What began as a protest in the capital quickly turned into a palace siege. Armed rebels stormed Gyeongbokgung, targeting those closest to the queen. The royal guards, ill-prepared and outnumbered, fell quickly. Loyal ministers, including members of the Min clan, were hunted and killed in brutal fashion. The Japanese military advisor, Orimoto Reizo, was assassinated, and the Japanese legation itself was attacked and burned. The chaos blurred lines between military revolt and political cleansing. At the center of it all was Queen Myeongseong, now the primary target. She did not wait for ceremony or deliberation. Hidden by trusted palace women and a handful of loyal officials, she fled through narrow passages, guided by those who still followed her despite the risk. In the confusion, she evaded capture and found temporary refuge, far from the familiar throne room, where she had once controlled court appointments and diplomatic policy. By morning, the courtyards of the palace were slick with blood. Bodies lay in silence where ministers once walked. The flames had quieted, but nothing in the capital was still. King Gojong, stripped of support, was powerless. The Daewongun, long sidelined, seized the moment to step forward again. Under the banner of restoring order, he took control of the palace. But the queen was not gone, and neither was the influence she had built beyond the palace walls. Within days, Qing China responded. Citing its role as protector of Joseon, it deployed troops under the command of Yuan Shikai. The Chinese forces entered the capital, restored order, and began reasserting influence over the royal court. The Daewongun, now seen as a destabilizing force by Beijing, was forcibly removed, abducted by Qing soldiers, and taken to Tianjin. In that act, the regional dynamic changed. Joseon was no longer only the subject of internal power struggles. It had become a space contested by rival empires. Queen Myeongseong returned to a palace that no longer felt like sanctuary. The walls had held too much silence, the corridors too many betrayals. Though she resumed her role, something fundamental had shifted. The Imo Incident had exposed the vulnerability of the royal household and the limits of personal networks. The bodies of her allies had not only been removed from the court, they had been erased from policy, from continuity, from the fragile structure she had built. Going forward, she would turn more forcefully toward external alliances. The internal court could no longer be trusted to safeguard her power. The old system had drawn blood. Now, her rule would take a different shape. Following the Imo Incident and the exile of the Daewongun, Queen Myeongseong returned to power not as a figure of celebration, but as a ruler hardened by bloodshed. The memory of courtyards stained red and allies dragged from the palace remained close. She had survived an attempted erasure, and survival, in a court full of shifting loyalties and foreign interference, came at the cost of growing isolation. Her policies became more strategic, her alliances more cautious, and her movements increasingly shielded. The queen now operated through layers of formality, of ritual, and of silence. Power had returned to her hands, but it no longer felt secure. Externally, Joseon stood at a dangerous crossroads. China, through the presence of Yuan Shikai, maintained military and political oversight. Japan, still reeling from its diplomatic humiliation after the Imo Incident, began preparing for a different kind of influence. And in the north, the Russian Empire, expanding rapidly into East Asia, saw opportunity in the kingdom's fractures. Queen Myeongseong, recognizing that no single ally could be trusted, played a delicate and complex game of diplomacy. She entertained Russian overtures while maintaining formal ties with China. Each move was calculated, designed not to provoke war, but to ensure Joseon's survival as a sovereign court amid imperial appetites. Inside the palace, however, the queen's reach was met with resistance. Reformist ministers, supported by her initiatives, began pushing for institutional changes, tax reform, modernization of the army, new schools, and the cautious adoption of foreign technology. These steps challenged centuries of Confucian hierarchy and threatened the foundations of the traditional court. The Yangban elite, whose influence had rested on stability and inheritance, viewed these changes as a direct threat to their privileges. Behind layers of agreement, distrust grew. Some nodded in the throne room and conspired in private quarters. The court no longer operated as a unified institution. It had become a fragmented arena of rival intentions. Amid these tensions, the queen's confidence turned to guarded vigilance. She ordered secret rotations of her attendants. Communications were reduced to handwritten notes, often burned after reading. Even her personal servants, once trusted, were dismissed without explanation. She had witnessed how quickly loyalty could shift. Meetings were held at night, behind closed doors, sometimes without the king's knowledge. To maintain control, she relied increasingly on whispers, on coded messages, on those who owed her everything or nothing at all. But no wall is high enough against fear, and fear, once planted, deepened into suspicion. Her gaze now turned constantly toward the edges of the court. Foreign envoys arrived with promises, but she had learned the cost of misplaced trust. Her own ministers presented reforms, but some of those reforms made her palace more vulnerable. And within the gilded silence of the throne room, the king's absence became more apparent. Gojong, cautious and indecisive, had grown more distant from direct rule. His reliance on his queen had once been a sign of unity. Now, it left her more exposed. And as the queen reached for modernity with one hand, the shadows around her throne stretched longer. Somewhere beyond the polished pillars and paper screens, her enemies had already begun to move. By the early 1890s, Queen Myeongseong's authority no longer moved freely through the court. What had once been a growing circle of influence, shaped by diplomacy, reform, and careful appointments, was now brittle. The silence that once protected her had become suffocating. Allies drifted away. Some, sensing danger, sought safer allegiances with foreign factions or rival ministers. Others remained close, but less openly. Their loyalty tested by shifting tides and private ambition. What lingered in the palace air was no longer confidence. It was doubt. The queen's control, though still visible in ceremony and policy, was no longer rooted in shared purpose. It had become a solitary burden. Rumors flowed in and out of the palace like smoke. Some claimed her attendants carried coded messages to foreign legations. Others whispered of poisoned letters, of bribes exchanged beneath the lacquered tables of the audience halls. Imported gifts arrived from foreign envoys, some filled with rare fabrics, others with unfamiliar scents and tinctures. She accepted them with ceremony, but rarely without caution. Servants were rotated more frequently. Courtiers were instructed, then dismissed. Trust no longer ran through bloodlines or alliances. It had to be checked and checked again. The queen now moved in layers, never alone, never fully at ease. King Gojong, once her partner in policy, now withdrew deeper into silence. His words were few, his presence passive. Whether from fear, calculation, or exhaustion, He allowed decisions to pass through him without resistance. To some, his silence was a sign of consent. To others, it was complicity. But for the Queen, it marked a shift, one that left her increasingly exposed to both domestic factions and external forces. In public, she remained poised. In private, her commands became more direct, her network narrower. Each effort to reclaim stability brought a new wave of resistance. Each new initiative was interpreted as desperation. Japan's ambitions in Korea had grown more assertive. Its legation expanded, its commercial presence deepened, and its military advisors returned. The Queen's attempts to strengthen ties with Russia as a counterweight were met with hostility, not only from Tokyo, but from within her own ranks. Some ministers, tired of foreign entanglements and suspicious of her strategy, began to block or delay her decisions. Others opened quiet channels with Japanese envoys, seeking favor or protection. These betrayals were not announced. They were hidden behind formal bows and courteous letters. But the consequences were real. Her decisions were undermined, her reforms stalled, and information about her movements began to circulate beyond the palace gates. Within her personal staff, once loyal attendants were replaced by figures whose origins were uncertain. Even among her handmaidens, there were names whispered as spies. Meetings once held behind secured doors found their contents echoed elsewhere. No decision remained private, no gesture remained unread. The court had become a mirror, filled with fractured reflections, each image distorted by fear, ambition, and outside interference. And then came the betrayal that reached closest, one she had not foreseen. A gesture misread, a presence allowed too near. It did not come with a blade, nor with force, but with a quiet shift in control. The corridors that once carried her voice now echoed with someone else's footsteps. The Queen still wore the robes of power, but the threads had begun to unravel. By 1895, Queen Myeongseong's struggle for sovereignty had narrowed into a final stand. The throne still bore her authority in name, but the forces pressing in no longer sought negotiation. They sought elimination. Japan, emboldened by its victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War, had turned its attention fully toward the Korean peninsula. Under the terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in April that year, China formally renounced its claim to influence in Korea. But this shift did not free Joseon, it exposed it. With China forced out, the fragile space between foreign powers collapsed. Into that vacuum, Japan stepped with speed, precision, and intent. Queen Myeongseong understood the implications. Without a counterbalance, Korea would become a protectorate in all but name. Her answer was not retreat, but resistance. She reached toward Russia, inviting deeper diplomatic engagement and signaling the court's desire for a new alliance. Russian advisors were welcomed. Plans were made for a joint military presence. It was a calculated move and a dangerous one. Japan viewed this as a direct threat to its regional strategy. Officials in Tokyo interpreted her actions not as diplomacy, but as obstruction. And among Japanese officers stationed in Seoul, the Queen's influence became the central obstacle to their plans for dominance. Inside the court, her position grew more precarious by the day. Japanese advisors were already embedded in military and political institutions. The Gabo reforms, introduced in the wake of the war, were drafted under heavy Japanese oversight. Many of the Queen's allies had been removed or assassinated. Some who remained did so quietly, their loyalty uncertain. Her world now moved behind closed doors. memoranda passed by hand, meetings conducted without records, messages sent abroad through carefully chosen envoys. But secrecy could not shield her from the structure collapsing around her. The court itself had become a space of contradiction. King Gojong, increasingly passive under pressure, was pulled between appeasement and fear. Pro-Japanese ministers held key positions, and whispers of betrayal filled the corridors. The Queen's personal guards were reduced. Her movements were tracked, her words recorded. And as she urged the king to stand against encroachment, his silence deepened. Still, she did not yield. Even as her presence brought risk to those around her, she continued to reach outward for treaties, for protection, for time. She believed there was still space to maneuver, but outside the palace, a different plan had already begun. Japanese officers had met with Korean collaborators. A list had been drawn. The Queen's resistance had been deemed irreversible. To secure their hold over the government, Japan could not simply marginalize her. They had to remove her. On the morning of October 8, 1895, before dawn touched the palace roofs, a unit of armed men crossed into Gyeongbokgung. Some wore Korean uniforms. Others spoke fluent Korean, masking their origin. They moved without announcement, guided by palace insiders. Their orders were clear. The sound of boots striking stone corridors broke the stillness reserved for ritual. The Queen's final warning had not come through paper or negotiation. It came in footsteps, measured, deliberate, and closing in. Before the first light touched the stone courtyards of Gyeongbokgung on October 8, 1895, a group of armed men moved through its gates without resistance. They wore the uniforms of palace guards and carried the manner of authority, but their presence was a deception. Among them were members of the Japanese military, officers from the notorious Black Dragon Society, and Korean collaborators with knowledge of the palace's inner pathways. Their target was not a structure or document, but a person, Queen Myeongseong. Orders had already been discussed days prior at the Japanese legation in Seoul. The Queen was to be eliminated. In the darkness of early morning, they passed through familiar thresholds. The court, long accustomed to layers of ritual and silence, offered little alarm. Those loyal to the Queen had been removed, reassigned, or silenced. Resistance was not expected, and none came. The assassins moved quickly toward the Queen's private quarters in Okoru Pavilion. Her location had been given to them by insiders. What occurred next was never fully documented, and the records that once might have told the truth were later destroyed, altered, or buried by design. Testimonies from survivors would later emerge, many years after the incident, speaking of a brutal confrontation. The Queen, unarmed and surrounded by attendants, was overpowered. Multiple accounts agree she was dragged from her chambers. Whether she spoke, resisted, or remained silent will never be fully known. What is certain is that she was murdered in the palace she once ruled. Her body, according to later investigations, was desecrated and burned near the palace grounds in a deliberate effort to erase her presence entirely. No tomb, no procession, no ritual, only ash. The political consequences were immediate. With the Queen gone, Japanese control over the court solidified. Ministers sympathetic to Japanese interests moved swiftly into high office. King Gojong, stunned and surrounded, was forced into compliance. The Gabo reforms accelerated under Japanese direction, stripping the monarchy of much of its power. The court that had once bowed before Queen Myeongseong now spoke her name in whispers, until even that was forbidden. Officials were instructed not to mention her. Royal records omitted her fate. Foreign envoys protested, but the damage had already been done. Her assassination was not only a crime, it was a signal. She had been a monarch, a strategist, a reformer. But to the forces that orchestrated her death, she was more than that. She was an obstacle to imperial ambition, a woman who had used diplomacy and policy to resist domination. Her removal was not just personal, it was geopolitical. Her death marked the end of Korea's last coordinated effort to balance the ambitions of surrounding empires through internal leadership. By sunrise, the palace resumed its formal rhythm, but something irreversible had shifted. The silence that followed her assassination was not peace, it was absence. Her body had been destroyed, but the void left behind reshaped the court. The queen was no longer a figure within power. She had become its memory and its warning. In the years that followed her assassination, Queen Myeongseong's name vanished from public life. No monument was built, no state ceremony held. The royal records, under pressure from occupying powers and collaborators, avoided direct reference to her murder. Her death was listed vaguely, with no detail, no acknowledgement, no mourning. The place where she had once shaped court policy, guided diplomatic channels, and resisted foreign control fell under silence. Her body had been burned, her legacy buried. Even within the palace walls, the memory of her voice became something dangerous to repeat. Yet memory has its own path, and it does not always obey the will of rulers. Whispers of her story lingered outside official halls. Among palace women and servants who survived that morning, fragments were passed on in low voices. What she wore that night, how she moved, who betrayed her. In markets and kitchens, in the homes of minor nobles and teachers, stories formed and reformed. Some were facts, some were questions, and some were only hope. During the colonial years, when Japan moved to erase Korean history and language, references to Queen Myeongseong became acts of quiet defiance. School teachers spoke of her legacy between approved lessons. Seamstresses stitched her family crest into garments meant only for funerals. She had died resisting empire, and for many Koreans, she came to represent the sovereignty that had been taken from them. King Gojong, her husband, responded to her death with caution and retreat. Under the watchful eyes of Japanese officials, he said little in public. But in 1897, 2 years after her assassination, he made a symbolic move. He declared the end of the Joseon Dynasty and proclaimed the birth of the Korean Empire, elevating his title from king to emperor, an assertion of equal standing with foreign monarchs. It was in this act that Queen Myeongseong was posthumously named Empress Myeongseong. Though the gesture was heavily constrained by political circumstance, it was an attempt to restore some measure of dignity to her name and to signal that her vision for Korean autonomy had not entirely vanished. Even so, the decades that followed brought deeper shadows. Korea was formally annexed by Japan in 1910. The royal family was sidelined, then slowly dismantled. Historical documents were destroyed or altered. Public monuments to Korean rulers were removed or replaced. For a generation, the story of Empress Myeongseong survived not in textbooks, but in fragments, in songs, in letters, in hidden corners of private homes. The silence imposed on her memory mirrored the broader silencing of Korean identity. But silence does not erase. It only delays reckoning. In the mid-20th century, as Korea emerged from occupation and war, historians began to reconstruct the facts. Declassified documents, personal testimonies, and foreign accounts slowly brought clarity to what had happened in Gyeongbokgung that morning in 1895. International investigations confirmed Japan's role in the assassination. Korean scholars began to reframe her life, not simply as court politics, but as early resistance to colonialism. In her policies, they saw the tension between tradition and modernization. In her death, they saw the cost of defying empire. Today, Empress Myeongseong is honored as a national figure. Statues bear her image. Plays, films, and exhibitions tell her story. Textbooks now include her name, not as a footnote, but as a chapter in Korea's long fight for sovereignty. For many, she represents the complex position of a woman who ruled within the boundaries of a patriarchal court, yet pushed against the limits of her time. Her diplomacy, once questioned, is now studied as strategy. Her reforms, once resisted, are now seen as part of Korea's transition into the modern world. And still, questions remain. Was she a monarch navigating a collapsing dynasty? A queen who sought survival in a world ruled by empires? Or a woman ahead of her era, punished for understanding too much too soon? Her death gave no answers, but in the silence that followed, a voice began to rise, not only for her, but for the country she tried to protect. In the long arc of Korean history, Empress Myeongseong remains both scar and symbol, erased by force, remembered by will. Her name was forbidden, but never forgotten.